Hello, my name is Jakob Christensen and I am a developer at Sitecore. In this presentation I'm going to talk about the SPEAK UI framework in Sitecore and how it enables developers to build very rich web applications. So the foundation of Sitecore is really an enterprise level content management system. It is 100% written in C# and it was actually the first .NET based CMS that was released in Denmark. It was originally very heavily influenced by XML and it used XSLT transformations to generate the web pages. But as websites have grown much larger over time, Sitecore is now using SQL Server to store its content, and the rendering engine in Sitecore now supports both web forms and MVC, and a number of homegrown systems as well. It is important to emphasize that Sitecore is data template oriented and not page oriented as many other content management systems are. The very core element in Sitecore is an item which has a data template. Each data template can have a number of fields, and as such you can view a data template as being a type and an item as being an instance of a data template. And you can actually even specify inheritance between data templates. Each item can have a layout, which is a definition of how this item is rendered as a web page. A layout is typically just a long list of renderings that each generate a chunk of HTML based on the current context or item. For instance, if you have a text rendering, it can output the text field on the current item. And in a simple web page, you would typically have a top menu rendering, which renders the menu, a left navigation pane, and a body text. And each of these elements could be rendered by a rendering each: the top menu rendering, the navigation rendering, and the body text rendering. But for more advanced web pages, you often need more control of how and where each rendering is placed within the web page. For instance, you could want to embed an image into the body text, and Sitecore enables this by offering a concept we call placeholders. And a placeholder is really a marker that indicates where other renderings could go. So for instance, in the body text, the developer would insert a placeholder marker in the right place in the HTML that the body text outputs. And when the body text rendering is rendered, it will look for other renderings that should go into this particular placeholder. And it would look for those renderings within the layout definition. Placeholders are very powerful, and it allows Sitecore developers to build web pages from fairly small and fairly generic building blocks. From an implementation-wise point of view, renderings are usually just a web form user control or an MVC view. Now the UI for Sitecore is based on Sitecore itself. The Sitecore client is just a Sitecore website. And it was created back in 2004, before there were any of all these nice JavaScript libraries that we use today. Libraries like jQuery, Prototype, Backbone, Knockout, all those kind of very cool and nice libraries. So at that point it was written in vanilla JavaScript, and it was actually pretty advanced for its time. During development of the Sitecore client, we had quite a number of issues with performance and just the sheer amount of JavaScript that we would load into each frame. And this was way before JavaScript was optimized in any way. So we had to work around this issue. And we came up with a fairly unique solution. What we did is we implemented a very small JavaScript core, which could sort of like be remote controlled from the server. So this core would be able to update the HTML DOM, and it would be able to send off state information to the server. And the way it would work is that, for instance, when a user clicked a button, the core would collect any state information on the page and would send off the request to the server. And the server would then process this information and apply any business logic onto it. And then it would send back a list of commands that would instruct the core on what it should do. And the JavaScript core would then sort of like update part of the HTML, or it would set an attribute or whatever it needed to do. And this approach allowed us to have a fairly thin JavaScript core and a fairly thick server. And we have actually even implemented a new way of rendering HTML, which was very heavily influenced by SAML at that point. We thought SAML was the greatest thing ever. Now, this approach has been great for Sitecore for quite a number of years, and the reason for that is that JavaScript was less mature, and good JavaScript people were very rare and hard to come by. So having most of the logic placed on the server was actually a very good thing during this time. It also allowed JavaScript developers, which are usually very hardcore backend developers, to create reasonable UI, something that is sometimes challenging for them to do. And it also allowed them to avoid JavaScript, which unfortunately many still to this day consider to be a lesser programming language. This approach was used in-house and was never really adopted outside Sitecore, and that is probably due to the fact that back in those days websites didn't really require that much interaction beyond a simple form or maybe a search. But that has of course been changing in recent years. Websites are becoming much more advanced, and the interaction on the page is becoming more and more rich. And I think this has in part been driven by the fact that JavaScript has been maturing tremendously, both in terms of libraries but also in terms of tooling. And good JavaScript people are becoming less rare. So now at Sitecore we found ourselves in a situation where we had to support rich web applications, and we had to do something for the very good front-end developers. Supporting back-end developers was no longer just enough for us to do. So this has led us to develop Sitecore SPEAK, which is really the next generation UI framework in Sitecore. And as stated before, the goal of SPEAK is really to enable very rich web applications with very deep interactions and still build on top of the Sitecore rendering engine. So the initial requirement is of course that a rendering is no longer just about rendering HTML. It has to have an interaction part as well, and this part has to run in the browser. So at a very basic level, SPEAK just extends renderings with a JavaScript file. And for the rest of this presentation, we're going to call this a component. A component in SPEAK follows the MVVM pattern in the sense that it exposes a number of public properties that can or cannot be modified, but any changes to these properties will be handled internally within the component, and the component will then update the HTML DOM accordingly to whatever changes are made to these properties. This is a fairly common approach to implementing widgets in JavaScript. Libraries like jQuery UI uses a very similar approach. So let's try and build a component in SPEAK. Here we are in Visual Studio, and before I get started I should say that we have a Visual Studio plugin called Sitecore Rocks, which enables us to develop Sitecore sites very quickly. And I'll be using that extensively throughout this demo. First of all, we have an app folder, which is where I will put my demo. And we have the Sitecore tree over here, which also has an app item. And if we look at the layout for this app, we will see that it has 6 renderings. And if we look in the browser on how this is rendered, the web page, it looks like this. So let's go back and try and add a button to this layout. We will add a new item. It's in SPEAK, and we'll do a SPEAK component. We'll call this my button, and ask us where to put it in the Sitecore tree. Put it here. I will get this MVC view, and we'll just put in some text here, and we'll change this to a button like that. And in the layout, we'll drop the button in here. Save that, and we'll do a build. I'll go back to the layout and refresh. And here is my button. Now let's add some parameters to this button. I will go here and I will create what we call a parameters template. And we'll say that this particular button has a text property. We'll go here and we will create a strong view model, a strongly typed view model. And we can see here we get the text properties, it's right down here. Let's go back into the view, and you'll see it has actually changed my model up here. And what we'll do is we'll just output the model text property here. Let's go back into the layout, and we will see that this one will change the ID. We'll say that's this my button 1, and we'll call this hello world, like that. Build that. Go back here. This is changed to hello world. Now let's try and make this button a little bit interactive, so that when we click it we actually get a little box. So first thing we'll do is we will create a Typescript file, and on this one we'll put in a click function, and it will simply go alert hello world, like that. And in our view we need to do a little bit of things. First of all, we need to hook this up into the entire Speak interaction framework. So we'll do that by outputting a number of HTML attributes. And secondly, we'll say on this one we will use knockout to bind both to the click and the text property. So we'll do click and we'll do text, like that. And we'll build that. Go back, click this one, and it says hello world, like that. Now let's add another component to our application. We will go here and we will add a text control. So we will do a speak component again. We'll call this my text. We'll put it here again. And for this one we'll do much of the same things we just did. So we will add a parameters template. We'll say that this one has a text property. We will add a view model, has the text property again. And we will add a Typescript file just for that. We will edit the file and we will data bind this. So we'll say model data bind. We'll just bind text, and we will output that model HTML attributes, like that. We will drop this into our layout, put it right down here, and we will go into our Typescript file for this one, and we will say, unfortunately we have to cast this to any, and we'll say the app, and we'll say my text1.text equals hello world. So this should, whenever I click the button, it should update the text on the my text1 control. Build that. refresh the page. We'll click it, and it says hello world. Now this is kind of interesting because now we have the page built up. We have two components in this page. So if you go Sitecore app, we can see a number of objects down here. We have the My button, we have My text. That actually means that I can change things from here. So I'll go My text 1 text, and I'll set that to this, and it updates. And I can change the label on the button as well. My button 1 text says hola, like that. So this is how you build components in Speak. But this approach doesn't really consider how all the components work together, how they interact, and a component is really just an isolated instance. It has no knowledge of all the other components on the page. Now, I am an old school developer. I learned Turbo Pascal during college, and in my first job we built a big application in Delphi, and Sitecore has been developed on .NET. And during all these projects I've been using WinForms, WebForms, VPF, and the common paradigm in this environment has always been a window or a dialog or a page or a code behind. And the idea is that there is a single central object that drives the page, and on this object you bind all your components together. So we thought, why not do the same in Speak? Let's have a central object where you can bind your components that are on the page together, and you can delegate from this object to your business logic. Well, we couldn't really modify the rendering engine in any significant way, so we came up with the idea of having this object as a rendering, as a component, and we will call this component the page code. So basically, the page code is a component that you drop onto your layout, and this will bootstrap all the interaction parts on your page. The way it works is the page code will look for markers in the HTML and instantiates components from these markers. This results in a model of the page, just like we saw in the demo before, that represents all the components on this page. From the page code, you have direct access to all the components on the page. And that is, of course, if the components actually have an ID and is not nested inside other components. So let's try and build a page code. So back to Visual Studio. And here is the layout for our demo application, and you can see the very top rendering. That is actually the page code, and this is where all the magic in Speak happens. It's in this one. You can specify a JavaScript file for the page code. If you don't, it's just generated for you. But for this example, let's try and build one. So we will create a new Typescript file. We'll call this the app page code. And in this one we'll declare class. We'll call it the app page code. And we will register this with Sitecore. Just have dependencies here, and then we will do a new app page code. Like that. Up here we'll declare our text 1 property. We'll just do that as an any. And the initialize function is called by the Speak framework to initialize whatever you need in this page code. So we'll do the text 1. That's not actually text 1, it's my text 1. And text, and we'll set that to, just to set it to something initial value. Like that. We'll build that, and then we'll go back to the here, and we will point this property to this to the new file. So it's Sitecore shell client app page code.js. Go here. And now when we refresh, we can see that the text has the initial value here. And we can actually still click the button and we'll change that. We showed the Speak framework to a number of developers in-house, and while some liked it, there were also some resistance to it. Some developers were not happy about the outlook of having to use and learn JavaScript. So we thought about how we could make life easier for them. Again, we tried to reach back, and one of the ideas was to implement data binding between components. This would significantly reduce the amount of JavaScript that the developers would have to write. Since we already have the model of the page in place, it was quite easy to provide simple one-way data binding. And as it has turned out, data binding is one of the most powerful features in Speak today, and it has allowed us to create very complex pages with no page codes simply by binding the components together. Let's have a look at one of the complex dialogues. This is the Sitecore client, and the very bottom field here is an image field. And when I click the browse button, we get this dialog. And this dialog has been entirely built in Speak, and there is no page code whatsoever on this page. So I can do a number of things here, and I can search for Vista, and get back, and I can look at the filters and say I want to see just the big images. Now the way that this dialog works is by having a data source that is hooked up to a Sitecore web service, and all the components on this page is hooking up to this data source through data binding. So this is a very classic example of how data binding is used in Speak. Back to Visual Studio. Let's try and do a little data binding with our components. So the first thing I'll do is I will add an input box. I'll have this Bootstrap 3 input, and I'll just move that above my text. And I will say that my text, the value of that, I will data bind that to the value of the new input box that I just put in. And it's right here. You can see this syntax looks fairly familiar from a VPF point of view. So let's try that. Let's go into the browser and refresh, and we get an input box here. And I will type hello world, and the text box updates, and I can go again like that. So let's just do a little bit more fun. So what I can do as well is I can take my button and the text on that one, instead of hello world, I can bind that not to the input but actually to the text of it. So I'll get a sort of cascading data binding. Go back, save, we'll update here. You'll notice that the value, the label, has changed to initial value, and we will go Speak like that, and it works. So that's how data binding works in Speak. Another idea for making life easier for JavaScript challenge developers was the idea of rule-based logic. Sitecore contains a rule engine which is very much influenced by rules or quick steps in Outlook. It is used in numerous scenarios throughout Sitecore, and it's actually quite powerful. It allows non-programmers to specify logic in a fairly understandable way. And it seemed like a great idea to offer the same functionality in Speak. So in Speak, a rule, it has three parts. First of all, it has a trigger, which is what initiates the evaluation of the rule. It can be anything. The user clicking a button, entering some text into an input box, or resizing the window. It can fairly be anything. Next, it has a set of conditions that must be fulfilled. And lastly, it has a list of actions that are executed if the conditions are true. So let's have a look at how rules work in our demo application. Suppose we want to hide the button whenever the user enters the word hide into the input box. Let's see if we can do a rule that implements this logic. So we go into Visual Studio, and I will add a new rule definition. And it gives me the rule editor right here. So we open that one, and the rule will be something like when the text of the input box equals hide, then hide the button, otherwise show it. So we'll add a condition says when the input 1 property text equals hide, then we will set the visibility of my button 1 to false, and we'll do the reverse rule, which says that if input 1 text property does not equal hide, we will set my button to true, like that. So that's the logic for this rule. We'll save that. We'll go back into our layout and we will add a rule rendering, and we will say that the trigger for this rule will be when the input control change text event, and then we will fire off our new rule like that. So here we are, and we'll go back, we'll refresh, we will type hide, and the button disappears. We'll show, it shows up, show again, and we'll hide it. So that's a piece of logic that was implemented just using rules. Let's have a look at the rule one more time. We can see it here. So this one kicks in when the text is set to hide, and we will do an action that says the component. Now we can add a lot of more rules and conditions and actions, and you can just see a list of some of the ones that we have in the system here right now. Now the way that rules have been implemented is actually kind of interesting, because you can look at these rules as a expression tree that gets evaluated. And the way it works is that when the trigger is activated, it will fetch the rule from the server, and the server will look at this expression tree, and it will build up a piece of JavaScript that will get evaluated on the client side. So we can actually go back into Chrome and have a look at what gets loaded. So we'll do a refresh, we'll do the hide, and we can actually see this rule gets fetched here. And if we look at the expression for this, you can actually see that this is how this is the generated code for the rule. So we have rule 0, which is the first rule, and we can see it it will set the my button and will do something that's set to false. That will actually set the component visibility. And we can see there's a condition here up here that tests if the input text equals hide over here. So we can see the next rule is placed here, and it has the entire both rules are evaluated here at the very bottom of the string of the source code. So this is actually a very interesting way of evaluating these rules. We leverage JavaScript for actually implementing the logic. The last bit to win over the hardcore backend developers is actually supporting TypeScript. The first question I used to get when demoing Speak was, does it support TypeScript? And initially Speak didn't support TypeScript as it was in beta, and it seemed like there were a lot of changes to the language during development. But when TypeScript reached version 0.95, we decided to add support, and TypeScript is now fully supported in Speak version 1.2, as you have seen throughout the demos in this presentation. And TypeScript really is a perfect match for Speak. First of all, it seems to remove a lot of the apprehension of JavaScript for backend developers. They do not perceive TypeScript as being a lesser language, as they seem to do with JavaScript, and this removes a huge adoption barrier for Speak. I can say personally, as an old school backend developer, TypeScript felt like coming home again. All the ambiguity and tricks and traps in JavaScript seems to be removed by TypeScript. For instance, there's a very clear single way of doing inheritance instead of the 4 common ways of doing it in JavaScript. And in JavaScript, I'm often unsure if I'm doing it the right way. TypeScript also provides excellent tooling. Many backend developers live and die by IntelliSense, and TypeScript provides IntelliSense to them in a way that JavaScript simply cannot do. The TypeScript compiler catches a lot of errors up front, which backend developers are used to, and this will certainly increase the quality of the code. From a Speak point of view, TypeScript helps backend developers with their somewhat irrational fear of JavaScript. It eases the transition from server-side coding to client-side coding. And as web applications become increasingly bigger and more complex, the code and models also becomes more complex. It's my impression that JavaScript scales to a certain point, beyond which it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain, and TypeScript scales much better, allowing the application to be crazy complex without actually hurting the maintenance part of it. And this goes both for the page model and the page code. And finally, I'll say that Sitecore has a key company value of being cool and fun, and TypeScript has created a lot of buzz and is generally perceived positively by both backend and front-end developers. And when we support TypeScript, we signal that Sitecore is still cutting edge and it's cool and it's fun, and that's because TypeScript is also very much cool and fun. And that's it for this presentation. I'll say thank you for listening.